Hi there, it's Llarold, and today I'm putting out a guide on the trinkets available to tanks from the Eternal Palace. There are 3 defensive trinkets and a whopping 5 offensive trinkets that are all hypothetically useful to tanks, and I just want to evaluate each of them and break down just how useful I think they will all be. So let's go ahead and just jump right in. Let's start with the defensive trinkets, since they're specifically designed for tanks. And for the first time in this expansion, there are actually 3 usable defensively oriented trinkets all dropping in a single raid, so you have some options. First up is Bloodthirsty Urgent, which provides a significant amount of healing over time. Effectively, this trinket will heal you for 10% of all damage you take as long as you don't die or reach the cap. And that's really solid. Reaching the cap is possible eventually depending on fight mechanics, but even once you've reached that point, at 445 item level, it's still worth roughly 4,500 HPS, which is still very good. A really nice feature of this trinket is that when you're at full health, it will stop healing and just pool the remaining reserve healing you have. That's very good for tank swaps. I could see this trinket having some problems in situations where you suddenly take huge bursts of damage, and the fact that it doesn't just provide direct damage reduction is a strike against it. Still, I do think this will probably wind up being the best overall defensive trinket for virtually every scenario. Next up is Chain of Suffering, which grants you a pretty serious defensive cooldown at the expense of another player in your group. This is probably the item with the biggest potential for griefing that I've ever seen. While you can't use it to outright kill another member of your group, you can definitely use it to bring their health low enough that they could die to normally non-threatening sources of damage. I think the intended design is for you to use this and transfer damage taken to your other tank, and that's a decent design for raids, I suppose. In Mythic Plus, though, this thing just seems like a murder trinket. I think it's also worth noting that this is the only defensive cooldown trinket I've ever seen that literally doesn't reduce damage. Your healers still have to do exactly the same amount of healing to keep up, it's just split between 2 targets. Depending on your healer, that could be easier or harder, I guess. This is almost the exact opposite of the Bloodthirsty Urchin, in that I think it's potentially a useful defensive cooldown for huge burst damage, but it's almost completely worthless outside of that. This trinket isn't versatile at all. Last, and definitely least among the tank trinkets, it's Edicts of the Faithless. Mechanically, this trinket is a bit weird, but it isn't bad. It provides the ability to absorb ever-increasing amounts of physical or magic damage. It can be swapped, but since doing so resets the ramp up, that's probably not ever going to be a good idea during combat. Just as a side note, monks have the unique distinction of converting a significant portion of all damage taken into physical damage, since all staggered damage taken is physical. That's right, all stagger damage is physical, so for monks leaving this set to physical all the time is a good idea. Given that the majority of tank damage in BFA is physical, I think it's probably the right case for the other 5 tanks in 99% of scenarios to just leave it as physical as well. Now here's the bad news. As it currently stands, this trinket is not a significant upgrade over Diamond Laced Refracting Prism, even at 30 item levels higher. It's disappointing. At 445 item level, this trinket doesn't provide as much absorb value as a 415 Diamond Lace Refracting Prism until you've reached 5 stacks, and unlike the Diamond Lace Refracting Prism, this thing has the weird exclusivity between physical and magic damage. It doesn't scale with haste, and it doesn't stack up during taunt swaps. It may be more versatile than that weird Chain of Suffering trinket, but it's just not very good overall. But wait, there's more, and it's worse. About a week before the Eternal Palace opened, this trinket was changed to have a 40-second reset interval. The absorb value was buffed to compensate so that it provides the same base healing per second, but the ramping increase per stack was not. Unfortunately, that means that instead of taking an already really long 2.5 minutes to stack up to full power, fully charging this trinket takes 400 seconds, which is well over 6 minutes. It will take some pretty significant buffs to the absorb values for sure, but I do think that this trinket can be okay mechanically. It'll never be as nice as the Diamond Lace Refracting Prism in terms of design, but a nice big buff can certainly make this trinket feel more like an upgrade without totally needing to redesign the way it works. In conclusion, don't use this trinket right now, but hang on to it in case it gets buffed. It could be good later. It just isn't right now. The Eternal Palace also has 5 offensive trinket options for tanks, and a couple of them are extremely interesting. Ajara's Font of Power is the first and only one of these trinkets that's flagged as a tank trinket. This trinket requires you to channel, potentially up to 4 seconds, and rewards you with an absolutely skull-exploding amount of primary stat for doing so. Yes, channeling while tanking is risky and bizarre. So in Raid, I think you'll want to try to use this during taunt swaps, or while bosses are casting abilities at Raid members. In Mythic Plus, I think you'll want to use this before pulling large trash packs or bosses. For Warrior and Pally, the ability to use this and then pop your massive collection of offensive cooldowns is extremely enticing. And for the rest of the not great offensive cooldown having tanks, it's still worth a significant increase to your offense and defense. Overall, a very weird but interesting trinket. Ashvane's Razor Coral is the first of the 4 DPS spec only trinkets, and it's by far the best. The initial use debuffs a single target, giving all your attacks against them a chance to trigger a basic damage proc. Every single time that proc happens, it also adds a debuff stack. The debuff doesn't do anything on its own, but if you use the trinket a second time, you transition into a crit buff mode, consuming all of the debuff procs you have active and granting yourself a crit buff that scales with how many debuff stacks you've just consumed. For classes with offensive cooldowns, so again, Warrior and Pally, this is a great trinket to let ramp up until your cooldowns are ready to go. Then you pop them, pop this trinket to get a huge boost to your crit chance, and you go crazy. Even for tanks without offensive cooldowns, this trinket can help you create huge burst windows just by adding a ton of on-use crit chance when adds spawn or bosses have increased damage taken phases. Now this trinket has a few flaws. First off, when you're in crit mode, you can't stack up the debuffs, so there are some great heights, but there are also some pretty significant lows. And that means that there's some potential for user error. This trinket also doesn't do very well with frequent mob switching, since if you put the debuff out on a target and then stop attacking it in order to attack something else, that's kinda useless. There's also a significant degree of ramp up into getting the crit buff going, which isn't perfect, but all in all, this is a tremendous trinket. On a positive personal note, I managed to snag this trinket in Heroic this week, and I decided to do some testing by auto-attacking a dummy while I was making dinner before recording this video. I can conclusively say that this trinket stacks cap at 100, and the crit chance provided by that at 430 item level is over 130%. I'm not sure how useful that information is, but now we know. In terms of the basic damage proc, it has a base proc rate of 6 procs per minute. That's pretty good. At 445 item level, that proc is worth around 1200 DPS on its own. And that's before accounting for the increase to your proc rate granted by haste. Assuming that you use this trinket at 6 stacks, it's worth 696 crit rating for 20 seconds. If you do that every minute, it's worth 232 crit on average, which is again pretty good, and again it stands to be a lot better if you're lining this crit buff up with add spawns or offensive cooldowns. In terms of how good this trinket actually is, it looks like a better option than most of the basic single target damage proc trinkets from Mythic Plus, and most of the basic stat proc trinkets from Mythic Plus. It also possesses a degree of versatility that all of the Mythic Plus trinkets lack, and I really appreciate that. In terms of competing with the other raid trinkets, it pretty much just blows them all out of the water. Next up is another trinket that's confusingly flagged as DPS only, Vision of Demise. It provides a decent sized chunk of haste as an on-use effect. The increased haste based on your target's missing health is interesting and definitely adds a lot of value, but unfortunately this trinket is somewhat undertuned. At 445 item level and used on a full health target, this is only worth 678 haste for 10 seconds, which comes out to 113 haste on average. That's not good at all. Gaining 100 haste per 10% health your target is missing is nice, so just to compare it again on a target that's under 10% health, maximum effectiveness, it's worth 1578 haste for 10 seconds, which is around 263 haste on average. That's pretty good and a decent step up from a trinket like Razan's Gleaming Eye. It's also, unfortunately, the best possible scenario for this trinket. If you compare it right around the average, so an extra 450 haste per usage, it's a significant step down from a trinket like Razan's Gleaming Eye. Now here are the positives. Strength tanks can use this alongside Razan's Gleaming Eye. You do have 2 trinket slots after all. In ad fights, you can try to use this on low health ads, and get a big haste proc to pump up its value. And just in general, because it's an on-use effect, the ability to control when you use it is a nice bit of power. Now here's the bad stuff. At its base power, without getting to use it on a target that's fairly low health, this trinket is really badly undertuned. The effect is also way too short for most tanks to get full use on their offensive cooldowns out of it. You could layer it over a Blood DK's entire dancing rune weapon, I guess, if you want to call that little thing an offensive cooldown, but that's kinda it. In any case, I think the fact that this is a haste trinket that's usable for strength and agility tanks is very interesting. Agility tanks have basically only had 2 decent options available this entire expansion. Dice from Freehold, which are pretty good, and Galeculler's Boon from Shrine of the Storm, which is good if you can stand still and very bad if you can't. If you're able to make full use of the extra haste effect from low health targets by targeting ads, this trinket can provide a ton of extra value. For normal single target fights where you're just going to be at the mercy of the boss's regular health pool, it's not all that great. And now let's finish up with 2 weird trinkets. First up, behold, the delicious Tide Pod. It's very strange. It works exactly like it would look like it would work. It stacks a debuff on the enemy repeatedly until they hit 30% health. At that point, all the stacks explode, doing a huge chunk of burst damage. Then the trinket does nothing until the enemy dies. At this time, the stack explosion is capable of critting, which means that doing everything you possibly can to buff your crit chance right before the enemy hits 30% health is critical to maximizing your DPS. The proc rate appears to be 8 procs per minute, which is very high, and the indication is that this trinket's proc would average a bare minimum of 1050 to 1200 DPS at 445 item level, which is fine, but it's also somewhat of an overestimate if you don't manage to make that 30% burst crit, since this trinket doesn't do anything once the target's gone below 30% health. Now, assuming that the boss's health goes down evenly is not a good assumption. There are execute effects, like this very trinket, and they will push that last 20 to 35% of the boss's health faster than the first 80 to 65%, but you can still assume that this trinket won't be active for a quarter of the fight at least, and that really isn't great, especially when you consider that Ashvane's Razor Coral is worth more DPS and has the unique crit buff aspect to it. I would say this seems much more like a PvP trinket for like arms warriors than a PvE trinket for tanks, and it's definitely not anything special. Maybe it could be useful for pure single target damage in some unique circumstances, but I'm just not holding out a lot of hope. And finally, it's my least favorite trinket of the bunch, Phial of the Arcane Tempest. It grants a small AoE damage proc, emphasis on small. At 445 item level, it deals about 1420 damage every 2 seconds and has an uptime of around 33%. So this trinket averages 700-ish AoE DPS while it's active, which is significantly less than a single rushing Jadewind cast.
But wait, there's some good news. If this trinket is only hitting one target, it ramps up its damage over 4 seconds, causing it to actually deal pretty significant AoE damage. So as a tank, how do you only hit one target with an AoE, then move back towards the group to AoE them all down? Good question. I don't know. In the right situation, this trinket could be really good, but in normal AoE or single target, it's pretty disappointing. I wouldn't be surprised to see this thing receive some decent-sized buffs as a result.
Well, I think that about covers it. If you have any questions about tank trinkets or any of the neat gear from Eternal Palace, ask away. Stay tuned for more patch 8.2 content, and as always, please like and subscribe. Thanks for watching. Hi.